The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." He replied to him, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbitrator?" Then he said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed. For though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told them a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest." And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, 'Now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for so many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong?' Thus will it be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
You may be familiar with the poster which says, "Life is fragile, handled with care." A slightly different version of that poster reads, "Life is fragile, handled with prayer." We are all very aware of how very fragile life can be. Our own various brushes with sickness can bring that home to us. Perhaps nothing brings home to the fragility of life to us more than the experience of the death of someone who has been significant to us. Our sense of the fragility of life will often lead us to find ways of making life as secure as possible, both for ourselves and those we care about. The question, how can we secure this life, this frail life of ours, will always be a significant one for us and can drive a great deal of what we do. Jesus often addressed himself to this issue of how best to secure our lives. He spoke a parable, for example, about one person who built a house on rock and another who built a house on the sand, as a way of contrasting those who secured their lives and those who failed to do so. In today's gospel reading, Jesus tells a story about someone who went about trying to secure his life in the wrong way. This wealthy farmer had a bumper harvest, more harvest than he knew what to do with. As a means of securing his life into the future, he went on building a spree, knocking down perfectly good barns and building bigger ones so to store the abundance of grain that he now possessed. However, although the farmer must have thought that he was acting very wisely, God goes on to address him as a fool man. The action he took didn't in fact secure his life. His life was suddenly cut short, and when he went before God, he had very little to show. For all his great abundance and frenetic activity, he had not secured his life. He had not made himself rich in the sight of God. Today's gospel reading invites us to reflect on the question, how can we secure the frail life of ours? In saying that parable, Jesus was teaching us that we secure our lives by becoming rich in the sight of God. The farmer in the story Jesus tells was rich in his own eyes, and no doubt the eyes of everyone else as well. However, he was poor in God's eyes. God's way of looking at people can be very different to how we look at them. As Jesus hung from the cross, he must have seemed the poorest of the poor to everyone who was there. Everything had been taken from him, including life itself. Yet, at the very moment, Jesus was abundantly rich in God's eyes. Although he appeared to have lost his life, in reality, he had secured his life. Indeed, he had secured life not only for himself, but for all who would turn to him in faith. We are rich in the eyes of God to the extent that God can recognize something of his own Son in us. Jesus was the perfect image of God, and the Apostle Paul reminds us in today's second reading that we are all called to be renewed in the image of our Creator, to become images of God as Jesus was, to become Christ-like. In becoming Christ-like, we will be rich in the sight of God, and our lives will be secure. As Jesus says towards at the end of the Sermon of the Mount, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise person who builds his house on rock. We find our security in growing into the person of Jesus, in listening to his words and acting on them. The farmer in the story that Jesus told invested in buildings, but Jesus himself always invested in people. And we become Christ-like to the extent that we too invest in people as he did. The great failure of the man in the parable was his failure to use his material resources to invest in other people. His world was bounded on all sides by himself. Here is a man whose hands are not opened and whose heart is not open because it is full of anxiety about the safe storage of all he possesses. You could say that he is full of himself. It is striking that he is the only person to live in the story that Jesus tells. There appears to be no room there from anyone else. When he speaks to himself, and his words always have to do with himself. My harvest, my barns, my grain, my goods. His speech is plugged with the words I and my. He thought he could secure his life by investing in himself. The message of the gospel, the message of Jesus, is that we secure our lives by investing in others. The man in the parable is not condemned for having great possessions, but for his failure to invest them in others, to use them in the service of others. The gospel reading invites us to ask ourselves, what are we doing with the resources that have come our way? Are we using them to invest in others or to invest in ourselves? Our resources include not just our possessions, but our time, our health, our gifts, and our abilities. In various ways, each one of us has been richly endowed by the Lord. It is in place of those resources at the service of others that we become rich in the sight of God and thereby secure our lives.